One cold December morning, I stood on my own porch while Karen Blackstone, the queen bee of our HOA, dragged two police officers up my driveway and told them this land was public property. She looked me straight in the eye, smiling like she'd already won, and declared my cabin was never mine to begin with. For a split second, I thought maybe I was losing my mind, but then I pulled out a piece of paper from a wooden chest that buried her lie like a stone in deep water. 6 months earlier, none of this seemed possible. I'd just retired from a life in architecture and come back to Pinecrest Ridge, the lakefront neighborhood where my dad had built this cabin back in 1965. The world had changed. What used to be modest family homes were now million-dollar fortresses with driveways full of SUVs. But the cabin stood just as he'd left it, weathered cedar-siding stone chimney, a porch that creaked like it remembered every generation that had stepped across it. My father used to call it his promise to the future, and after he passed I thought keeping this place alive was the least I could do. Then came Karen. She appeared one morning like a storm, rolling in heels, clicking hair perfectly frozen in place. That smile of hers, sharp as glass. Right there at the property line stood a brand new sign, Historic Public Trail, with an official-looking seal and a dotted line cutting right through my yard. She stuck out her manicured hand and said, "Mr. Cole, I'm Karen Blackstone, president of the Pinecrest Ridge HOA. We need to discuss your situation." The way she said situation made it sound like my existence was a crime. According to her research, had uncovered that my cabin sat directly on a historic Pony Express trail, which meant it belonged to everyone. She promised the paperwork was on its way, but I could tell she expected me to roll over right then. I didn't, so the war began. Within a week, I was drowning in violation notices, my cabin was non-conforming, my landscaping was unapproved, even my setback distances didn't meet their imaginary standards. Never mind the fact that this house was standing decades before their HOA even existed. Neighbors I'd never met were suddenly meeting without me whispering about how my cabin was ruining property values. It was all orchestrated by Karen, who knew exactly how to apply pressure without leaving fingerprints. And it worked, for a while. The real blow came when I opened the local paper one morning to see my name plastered across the front page. Local man conceals priceless heritage from public. There was my cabin photographed with a telephoto lens to make it look like a rotting shack. The article quoted experts I'd never heard of, all parroting Karen's story. On the radio, she painted herself as some kind of noble guardian of history. Online hashtags about saving the Pony Express started trending. My phone rang off the hook, people I didn't know calling me greedy, unpatriotic, selfish. And, I'll be honest with you, sitting in that cabin at night, lights off, staring at the old wood my father had nailed together with his own hands, I wondered if maybe I was the one being stubborn. Was I just an old man, clinging to something I should have let go? Maybe it would be easier to pack up and move. Let the tide of McMansions and HOA regulations wash over this place and erase it like everything else. But Sam Rodriguez was in his 70s, lived 2 houses down, quiet man who'd always kept to himself. One evening, after a particularly ugly HOA meeting, he slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand and whispered, "Call me tonight." Not the landline. The cell. At 9 o'clock sharp, I dialed his number and his voice shook as he told me to meet him at the old fishing pier the next morning. When I got there, he handed me a worn leather satchel and said, "This will change everything." Inside were documents, yellowed letters, maps, contracts, proving that Pine Creek Station, the Pony Express, a stop that supposedly made my land public, had been privately owned under federal contract with perpetual ownership granted to the station master and his heirs. Sam's grandfather had been that station master, and in 1965 he sold those protections to my father. Tucked inside was a signed letter from the U.S. Postal Service confirming it. Ironclad. Sam admitted Karen had tried to buy his silence for $20,000, and when he refused, she threatened to have his house condemned. His guilt was eating him alive, but his courage gave me mine back. Suddenly, I wasn't just fighting for a cabin, I was fighting for history, for truth, for my father's promise. I wasn't alone either. My daughter, Lily, drove up the next weekend furious after seeing my face splashed across the news. She was a third-year law student, and within hours she'd uncovered the missing piece. Karen wasn't just drunk on HOA power. She was being paid by Western Heritage Productions, a slick entertainment company that specialized in building fake historical experiences for TV. Their plan: bulldoze my cabin, replace it with a Hollywood-ready replica, then sell tickets to tourists and film a reality series. Worse still, they'd been pocketing federal tax credits for preservation while plotting destruction. Fraud, plain and simple. Armed with Sam's satchel and Lily's research, I finally felt the ground tilt back under my feet. But Karen wasn't done. The following week, she staged what she called a historic preservation festival at the community center, complete with banners, costumed volunteers, and a Discovery Channel producer named Jake Morrison, ready to announce the partnership. Cameras rolled, neighbors applauded. Karen's voice soared as she promised our community was about to make history. That was my cue. I walked down the aisle carrying my father's old wooden chest. My heart pounded as I placed it on a table in front of the crowd. Before we decide the future, I said, let's look at the past. I pulled out the federal land grant documents, raised them high enough for everyone to see, and read aloud: perpetual private ownership granted. Immunity from local seizure. The room went silent. Karen's smile faltered, but she tried to recover. Mr. Cole, sometimes personal sacrifice is necessary for the greater good, she said, her voice tight. That's when Sam stood up from the back. His voice shook at first, but then it grew stronger. Karen, you offered me $20,000 to bury these documents. You knew the truth and tried to buy it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lily didn't waste a second. She held up her laptop, projecting Western Heritage's payment records onto the big screen. This isn't about history, she told the neighbors. This is about money. Karen has been collecting monthly checks to hand over our land to a company that destroys heritage for TV ratings. The audience turned, murmurs rising into shouts. You lied to us. We trusted you. Even the Discovery Channel producer looked pale, pulling out his phone, whispering frantically to someone on the other end. Karen stood, frozen papers trembling in her hands, her carefully built empire collapsing in real time. No clever spin, no polished smile could save her now. The truth was out raw and undeniable, and the crowd that once applauded her now stared with open fury. And just like that, the battle was over. Karen stumbled out of the community center, her face chalk white, while the banners she'd hung still flapped above the stage like a cruel joke. The HOA that had backed her began to crumble the same week. Investigators moved in, and Western Heritage's fraud unraveled state by state. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I just stood there in that hall chest in front of me, the weight of my father's promise still heavy in my hands, knowing the fight was finally done. And if this story taught me anything, it's this: when lies rise on greed, they eventually drown in truth.